Welcome, everybody. Great crowd. Thank you for all coming out. And thanks to the candidates for working hard on their campaign and coming out for this one. So I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the League of Women Voters. I'm the president of the New Mexico League of Women Voters, and I'll be moderating tonight. I want to make a couple of introductions. We usually do this if we have elected officials in the room. So I'd like to introduce House Majority Leader Peter Wirth. We're 30 seconds in and I made a mistake. Senate Majority Leader. Rudy Garcia, who is a Santa Fe Public School Board member. And Ed Moreno, who is your county commissioner. And you all know by now that your candidates are Matthew McQueen, running as a Democrat. There's seats over here. And Jarrett Applewhite, running as an independent. So for the opening statements, I'm going to go in the order in which the candidates appear on the ballot. So first we'll hear from Matthew McQueen and then from Jarrett Applewhite. So we'll have 3-minute statements, and here's the mic.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the League of Women Voters for organizing this. They do a great job. It's warm in here. It's probably going to get warmer, so thanks for bearing with us. I would say to Rudy, you can take your tie off whenever you want. No one's going to object. So I'm Matthew McQueen, and I am the state representative from this district, District 50. I've been elected twice. I'm in my 4th year of service. I want to go back. There is work to be done, and I'm ready to go back to do it. A little bit about me. I'm a lawyer. I live in Galisteo, just down the road with my family. I have a wife and 2 little kids. My family won't be here tonight, in part because my 4-year-old son has soccer practice down at the school. So that's he just started that a couple weeks ago, and that's been pretty exciting. This is an important election. If you look at what's going on nationally, you know it's an important election. It's also an important election for the state of New Mexico. I've been in office for 4 years, and if I had one word to describe my service, it would be frustrating. There's so much we need to do, and we haven't got a lot of it done in the past 8 years, past 10 years. The paper the other day talked about the lost decade in New Mexico. We got hit by the Great Recession, and we never recovered. We're coming up on this golden opportunity to do really fundamentally good things for New Mexico, to shift New Mexico from sort of a grassroots, ground up, and get us finally headed in the right direction. So for example, it recently was announced that we are again dead last in the country as a place to raise a child. Last. I mean, that's horrible. But if we can do things like expand early childhood education, improve our educational system, improve our parent outreach for young kids, we can start to shift that. And it's not going to shift overnight. You know, after 4 years of a new governor or 2 years or whatever, you know, we're probably not going to be in the top 10. But they do this poll annually. And if we start picking up a couple spots each year and change that trend line, then that would be a victory. That we would start to make New Mexico the place it really deserves to be. There's a lot to be done. Education is a top priority. Economic development is a top priority. And for me personally, ethics has been a top priority. And I've sponsored a number of bills to improve the ethics of state government. And I hope we talk about those more tonight. But those have been my 3 priorities on the campaign trail: education, economic development, and ethics. A neighbor of mine, I was giving my little spiel. A neighbor of mine sort of raised his hand and he said, "Well, what about the 4th E?" environment. And that's right. And I tend to leave environment out, conservation out, because that's my background and that's my passion. I'm chair of the House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. My academic background includes natural resources. My work history is focused heavily on conservation. So that's something that I care passionately about. And because of that, I tend to sort of downplay in the legislature because it feels personal to me. But I know that's important to New Mexico as well. And part of the economic development that I think we need, part of the economic development is outdoor recreation and tourism. And so we need to conserve our natural resources so we can develop them as an asset. And that's something I believe strongly about. There's been proposals for an office of outdoor recreation, which Michelle Lujan Grisham has endorsed, and it's certainly something I support. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think we have a lot to talk about tonight. I'm pleased to be here. I'm happy to talk to you all. I'm always happy to answer any questions. I have an open door policy. I live pretty close by. I work pretty close by. If any of you want to follow up after the forum, I'm always happy to talk to you more. Thank you very much.
I came here 50 years ago as a troubled teen runaway. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I'd found a home. New Mexico's been really good to me. Shoeing horses and being a large animal vet tech were my first trades. When my back gave out, I became a business person. I've founded or co-founded half a dozen companies. They're all in business today. The information technology company I founded in Albuquerque 20 years ago is now a national company and still maintains a large office in Albuquerque. I was recruited by the McQueen Foundation to become the CEO of its Community Development Venture Capital Fund, for which I helped raise $14 million that was invested across the state. I've also had work experience in the public sector. My last job was as Chief Financial Analyst for the New Mexico Finance Authority. My public service life stretches back over 3 decades. I've served on a lot of boards and led a few of them. I was tapped by the mayor to co-chair his task force on affordable housing in '83. When our public schools failed to pass a bond issue, I helped found a group that brought the issue back and got it passed. I was elected to the Board of Ed in '94 and while there co-chaired a statewide task force on accountability. Friends, these are deeply troubling times. The character of our civic discourse is at an all-time low. We can't afford that. Nowhere is our lack of tolerance and civility more apparent than in our political dialogue. I blame our two-party system for setting us against each other, for the intense polarization, and for the gridlock. We must reclaim our humanity and recognize that we have so much more in common than that which separates us. I'm a pragmatist, a bridge builder, and I believe in compromise. New Mexico has the least competitive state elections in the nation. It's easy to see why. Our politicians use our redistricting process to pick their voters and as an incumbent protection racket. Only half the legislative seats in this cycle have an opponent. We're one of only 9 states that have fully closed primaries. Our ballot access laws are some of the most unfair in the nation. If I had been a Republican, it would have taken 25 signatures for me to get on the ballot. Because I'm independent, it took 310. We're near the bottom of many national state rankings. In part, this results from our lagging economy and social problems like poverty. But we don't have to spend a nickel to make our elections the most fair and most competitive in the country. With your help, we can create a legislative environment that makes us proud, one that is fair, that embraces transparency, with a stringent ethics framework. We can create a system that rejects special interest money and that will attract our children as voters and as candidates. Thank you.
Thank you. The first question, which will go to Matthew McQueen, what will be your first issue, your main issue priority if you're elected to the legislature? 2 minutes.
Main issue priority. In the legislature, it's interesting. all the legislators, come with a certain expertise. And I'm a lawyer and a background in conservation. Once you get there, though, you're sort of a generalist, and you have to vote on everything. I absolutely think the number one thing we need to do for New Mexico is expand early childhood education, so it's available for every child in New Mexico, and we have the means to do that. That being said, that's not my bill. That's not a bill that I run. I think it's a priority. The second priority, also not my bill, is we need to raise the minimum wage. Our minimum wage nationally has fallen way behind, and we need to raise that so people can make a living, working a 40-hour week. The bills I'm working on are largely the bills I've worked on before. The Public Corruption Act, which would take pensions away from corrupt elected officials. Community solar. So a group of people can build a large-scale solar facility, not like one of those big wind or solar farms in the desert, but something on one of the like the La Tienda or the Agora, and share in that. We need legislation to make that happen. Game Commission reform. Wildlife has always been near and dear to my heart, and our Game Commission has been a horrible political mess because they're all governor appointees. So I have a whole list of bills that I work on, and then while you're at the legislature, you work on really everything else that comes up. And I would mention at this point that I'm chair of the House Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which is great. I'm also on the Judiciary Committee, which is really interesting because all the big bills go through Judiciary. Thank you.
Jarrett?
So if I become the first person in the history of New Mexico to have the privilege of serving in our legislature who does not belong to a party, a lot of what I'm going to be working on will depend on how the partisans treat somebody who is not a partisan. I would like to serve on the elections committee, but being nonpartisan, I get to represent everyone. I don't have to, I'm not attached to a party platform, and I don't have to care about the people who disagree with me. I agree actually with Matthew that our schools and economic development, we have an economy that's lagging. All the states around us are prospering. We aren't, and we need huge changes in the way both our schools operate and the way our state government delivers services. I am going to run a lot of bills around making our election system more open to more voices. I think we suffer from a lack of turnout, but more than that, I think we suffer from a lack of candidacies. And anything I can do to get more people to run, I'm going to be working on that. But it is, as Matthew says, I think I'm going to have stature, even though I'm not a partisan, and even though I won't caucus with a party, because I think both parties will want to work with me. So I'm going to be, like Matthew said, I'm going to be a freshman, and there'll be a limited number I won't have control over all the things I get to rule on.
Thank you. This is another 2-minute question. We'll start with Jarrett. What would be the one priority issue that you would like to see in improving education?
Oh gosh, I think I agree with Matthew that of course we need to devote more resources to early childhood. We need to, we're lucky that it looks like going into this cycle we're going to have extra money. I'm a real fiscal conservative, and I'm very worried that a lot of people, or some people, like to take windfalls that aren't recurring and overspend. And we've got pension problems, we have severance, we have underfunded other issues. I don't think the answer is just money. I'd like to change the culture in the schools. The single thing I'd like to do is drive more authority away from the State Department of Education and distribute it to local districts who know how to run their jurisdictions better. Sorry.
So that's a little bit of a tough question because I don't think there's one single thing, but there are a lot of things we can do. You know, and of course at the top of the list is early childhood education. Right up there is we need to pay our teachers more. We have a 3-tier teacher system and we gave starting teachers a $2,000 bump, which isn't very much. And part of what that did was it compressed the pay scale. We need to pay all of our teachers more so we're competitive with surrounding states. We need to back off on the constant testing. You know, our students take way too many high stakes tests. We need to restore dignity and independence to teachers in the classroom. And one of the bills that I will be working on again, which I've introduced before, is to teach financial literacy, media literacy, and workforce readiness in the classroom as a high school graduation requirement. We can add a single unit graduation requirement. You gotta start to rearrange the other requirements. So you can have a class in sort of your senior year where you talk about what it's like to be an adult. What is it like to pay taxes? What does your credit score mean? How much interest do you really pay on one of those payday loans?
Yes.
I mean, these are life skills that our kids need to learn, and I would like all of our education to be more focused on real world applications rather than abstract, like, you know, ALGE 2 concepts, things like that.
This next one's for you too. I'll try to yell. Please explain your view of the state government's role in...
2-minute question, starting with Matthew. Please explain your view of the state's role in healthcare.
So, as I said, you know, you come to the legislature with your own expertise, and mine is not healthcare, I'll tell you that. But you also learn, you know, who in your caucus and who you caucus with is very important, and who in the chamber, and really who in the legislature has expertise. And we have a couple people in the House who are excellent on healthcare, Debbie Armstrong being perhaps the leader on that. The state's role, you know, a lot of that money comes through as federal. I've heard a proposal to enact a sort of single payer system at the state level. There was actually a presentation done in this room. That's, you know, intriguing to me. We got to make sure we can afford it, and we can afford it going forward. So, you know, we're coming into the session with this surplus of sorts, and it's one-time money. So anything we start, we need to make sure we use recurring money. In healthcare, we absolutely have to rebuild our behavioral healthcare system, which this governor destroyed. I mean, literally destroyed. She shut down all the providers and outsourced it to Arizona based on a fraud allegation, which eventually was proven to be false. So we're still recovering from that. And one last thing I want to mention on healthcare, you know, it's largely federal, Obamacare and all that. Healthcare is an incredibly important industry in New Mexico. So not just that healthcare providers, the care that people receive, but healthcare creates a lot of jobs, and good jobs. And if we want to develop New Mexico as a retirement destination, well, we need healthcare. And no one's going to retire here. We have beautiful places you can buy a house and retire. No one's going to retire if we don't have good healthcare. So healthcare is absolutely important.
I agree with everything Matthew just said. I think our healthcare system is shameful. I think that I want to be a voice for making it rational. Most of the allocation decisions and the delivery systems are decided at the federal level. So as a state legislator, you manage the funds that are allocated. But I'd like to, I'm so tired of the context in which healthcare is discussed. What we can say with certainty is that our GDP is consumed by a larger segment of our GDP is consumed by healthcare than most developed nations. Our outcomes are distinctly mediocre, and there are too many special interests at all layers. there are too many profit centers, and we all pay for each other's care. When people show up at the ER, they get treated and taxpayers pay for them. So it's really a fallacy to say, well, is healthcare a right? You're darn right. Our tax dollars pay for healthcare for people who are uninsured, for people who aren't citizens, and what we need to do is have a better system. It's crazy, just to take drugs for one example. We pay so much more for American drugs than Canadians pay for American drugs. Medicare doesn't even bid that out. There's a whole industry in that chain called the prescription benefit managers. They don't do anything except insert money. And the reason it's so shamefully expensive is because the special interests in all branches of that have their checks into the pockets of politicians.
Thank you. This next one starts with Jared as well. 2-minute question. Although immigration is a federal issue, we are a border state. What would you like to do or have the state do in terms of immigration issues?
So, being a border state, we have centuries of relationships with Mexico and with our partners to the south. We have a robust cultural history, we have a robust economic issue, but I don't think that New Mexico, I don't think that we should have a distinct immigration policy. Not only is that not legal, but it would be a folly to have a patchwork of different immigration solutions at different places in our border. So what I'd like to do is promote and build on the ties we already have, and on the larger issue of what should be done about immigration, I'd like to play a role with my colleagues in the legislature in making sure that our federal delegation is forward-thinking and gets rid of crazy ideas like building walls and separating kids and this kind of expensive and wasteful dialogue we have now that isn't doing anything for us.
So immigration is a federal issue. What's currently going on at the federal level is absolutely abhorrent. Separating kids, I agree that the wall is it's a monument to an ego. What the state can do, being that it's a federal issue, I mean, that's sort of the key, right? It's not the state's role or the county's role or any city's role to enforce federal immigration law. So when people talk about like Santa Fe being a sanctuary city, it's not that we're providing sanctuary. I mean, they're not providing some sort of umbrella. What they're saying is it's not our business to be enforcing federal immigration law. And if you get arrested for a minor offense, it's a minor offense. Violent offenses, people get arrested, can and should be held. And I think that's completely reasonable. But when you hear people talk about sanctuary this or sanctuary that, that's what they're talking about. That it is a federal issue, and it's not the state's obligation to enforce that.
Next question starts with Matthew. It's a 1-minute question. What is your opinion of campaign finance, and do you take PAC money?
I'm not sure why this is a 1-minute question. This is a big issue. We absolutely need campaign finance reform. Again, a federal issue, the Citizens United case. We largely cannot limit donations, especially the dark money, because of Citizens United. We can, however, require disclosure, and we should. I do take PAC money. Most of the PAC money I've received is from so-called leadership PACs. And the reason I take PAC money is because I can't drop $50,000 on my race like my opponent can. So it's a campaign financing, fundraising competition, and because I'm not a wealthy person, I'm at a disadvantage.
Gosh, nothing is more important than extracting the kind of money that corrupts people out of our elections. And my opponent in the 5 years he's sought political office has acquired over 100 grand, not just from PACs, but from lobbyists and special interests. I don't take any of that money. And yes, I'm fortunate to be able to loan less than 50,000, but he's right that it's shameful that you need to have a lot of money to run, and we need to fix that. Our campaigns take way too long, they're way too expensive, and I wouldn't, if I thought I had to take money from people who would like to influence the way I act, I wouldn't do it, period, end of story. And if it means I don't get enough money to win, that's okay.
I think we're going to break things up here a little bit and do 4 questions, 30-second lightning round. Starting with Jarrett. How do you feel about straight party voting?
Oh gosh, what a softball question. I think outsourcing your decision making to a party is crazy. I don't believe in it. I think the Democrats that are going to ask people to sign a loyalty pledge, it's wrong. I think people should vote for the best candidate. I think they should do their homework. I don't think it saves any time. It's not a mistake that 14 states have outlawed it since 1995 and none have brought it back.
I'm not in favor of straight ticket voting. I think voting is a civic duty. I think we should be teaching that in the schools. I think if you have to do a little work to get educated about the different races, you should do that. I also frankly think that if you don't know about a race or a ballot question or a bond initiative, it's okay to leave it blank. Along those lines, we elect judges in partisan elections. I don't think we should do that. We ask judges to be nonpartisan and then make them run in a partisan primary and appear on the ballot as Democrat or Republican. I think that's a mistake.
So,
I already did you, right?
You did me.
this is where I got confused. Starting with Matthew, what is your view on same-day
Registration.
Starting with Jarrett, sorry.
No.
Now I'm really confused. I didn't mark my ballot. So who did I end with? I'll start with you. Okay, what is your view on same-day registration on election day?
So I think voting is a civic duty, and we should do everything we can to make it easier, and absolutely we should have same-day registration.
Boy, we're in total alignment. Anything that makes it easier to vote, including voting by mail, anything that encourages people to participate is a really good thing. So automatic registration when you get your driver's license is a good thing. There are an array of things that'll help.
Thank you. Starting with Jarrett. Do you think we should have ranked choice voting in state elections?
Oh gosh, of course we should. We're all voters, and ranked choice voting amplifies our voice. And particularly in multi-party races, if we get rid of this two-party stranglehold on our democracy and you have 3 or 4 people running against each other, ranked choice voting makes sure that somebody gets at least 50%. And in my case, if there were a Republican in this race, people wouldn't have to worry about voting for me because they'd really be electing the Democrat or
I think ranked choice voting is one of those great new things. The city of Santa Fe did it, I think, to great success, and I would absolutely support it at the state level, including in the primaries.
Next one also for Matthew. Do you favor open primaries where all voters can vote for all candidates on a single ballot?
So again, this shouldn't be a 30-second question, but what I'm really interested in looking at is what's called a qualifying primary, where all the candidates run and the top 2 advance, and that has to be coupled with ranked choice voting. Those 2 things go hand in hand. If you have a primary with 8 people from 3 or 4 different parties, you need ranked choice voting in that qualifying primary.
Boy, this is horrible to be in so much agreement. What's a forum for? I mean, our open primaries are one of the biggest impediments that people who choose not to belong to one of the clubs have to contend with. There are many things that are unfair. Our democracy is constantly evolving. Primaries themselves were designed to move the locus of decision-making for who the candidate is away from party bosses. 30 seconds.
We're back to 2 minutes.
Okay.
First, starting with Jarrett. If the Ethics Commission passes in the November election, how do you see it functioning?
Boy, that's where the rubber hits the road. You know, there's all kinds of rulemaking, and there are a lot of things that partisans do to pretend that they agree with something, and they don't really. There have been a lot of independent redistricting bills that are supposed to be nonpartisan, but the members are appointed by partisans, so they're proxies, or they leave out factors in the bill, like they shouldn't favor any political party. So we need to have the best ethics framework in the United States. It won't cost us any money, and it's shameful it's taken so long to get so little done, and now the legislature can't get it out of both houses, and they have to let the electorate decide it. Shame on them.
Jared's wrong on that. It did get out both houses, and that's why it's on the ballot. It's a constitutional amendment, which is why the electorate has to vote on it. This is something I support. This is something I voted for. And by the way, it's on the ballot, so I encourage you all to vote for it when you vote in November. It's basically just sort of a framework. It allows the creation of the Independent Ethics Commission. And there was some debate about, when we were working on the bill, how much detail it needed. And some people wanted a lot of detail, and other people said, well, no, it's going in the Constitution. We're supposed to keep it kind of brief. And they ended up opting for the sort of brief outline. And if it passes, and I think it will then come back to the legislature for rulemaking and sort of fleshing it out. So this is absolutely a good step forward for New Mexico, and I think it's going to happen.
Also, a 2-minute question, starting with Matthew. Do you favor an independent redistricting process? And what might it look like?
Absolutely, I favor an independent redistricting process, and I always have. I think what it would probably look like is appointing, a certain number of members. You would get appointments from different people. There would be a cap on how many people from a particular party would be. So, like if it was a 5-member commission, for example, or let's say a 7-member commission, you could have no more than 2 or 3 from any party to make sure we have third-party independent representation. I really think that you could do redistricting mostly with a fairly simple mathematical formula that each district's got to have the same number of people. Okay, that's a legal requirement. But then you put in factors that you respect geographic boundaries and you respect physical boundaries. In my district, there's a mountain range that runs right through the middle. So to get to part of the district, you have to leave the district and go around the other way. You respect communities of interest. District 50 runs right down the middle of Stanley, right down the middle of Moriarty, right down the middle of Edgewood. That's not the end of the world. The mayor of Moriarty once told me, I asked him, what's it like having it split? And he said, well, that gives me 2 legislators I can go to for help. So, that there's a way to do that. I absolutely think we should go down that route. One thing I will point out, District 50 is a really odd, challenging shape. That doesn't mean it's gerrymandered. It wasn't drawn by the Democrats or by a political party to favor a political party. It was drawn by a court with Democrats and Republicans at the table. I don't know if there were independents there. They certainly would have had a right to intervene had they been interested. So it's an odd shape, but gerrymandered isn't really what it is.
We can disagree. We do disagree. District 50 is shamefully gerrymandered. It's gerrymandered to increase the power of Democrats. And it was done intentionally. Its two biggest cities, Edgewood and Moriarty, are divided in half. Its third biggest city, Estancia, was taken out of it. When the last redistricting was done in 2011, the intention was clearly to make it forever blue, and that's why you are voting in this district. It used to be a center of New Mexico farm and ranch district, and now it is an example of how not to draw a political map. It used to be a community of interest, the Estancia water basin, one of the most important aquifers in the state. It was redrawn so that the incumbent, Rhonda King, couldn't even run for it anymore because she didn't have ties in El Dorado. So the votes of El Doradans were amplified. The 4,700 voters on the other side of this mountain range, they should be voting in the Rio Grande corridor. And, you know, I am going to, it should be done by people who don't have a partisan interest. It really isn't hard. The Supreme Court in Pennsylvania just took a hard look at a redistricting map that was brought to them by a 9th grade geography class. With today's tools, it really isn't that hard. I think returning the Valencia counter voters to the Rio Grande corridor, bringing El Dorado back to Santa Fe, and restoring the Estancia Basin, that's a motivating force in my candidacy.
Thank you. Another 2-minute question. This is a little bit complicated, multi-part question, not great. On gun safety, do you support 3 things? Background checks, banning bump stocks and assault weapons, carry laws that would allow people with concealed carry permits to travel across state lines. And we start with Matthew.
I'm not sure about the way you worded the last one. I think the answer is yes. We have concealed carry laws in New Mexico. We should be able to respect our own laws. If you get a concealed carry permit in another state, that should not be valid in New Mexico. We absolutely should ban bump stocks. We absolutely should have universal background checks. We absolutely should have a mechanism to take guns out of homes where there's domestic violence. We need trigger locks on guns in homes that have children. You know, the list goes on and on. And these are really common sense gun safety propositions that are widely supported and that are blocked at every step by the NRA to a large extent and the Republican Party to a large extent. That's part of the reason why I think it's really important that we elect Michelle Lujan Grisham. We passed in the legislature a law to take guns out of the homes where there's domestic violence. And the governor, a former prosecutor who should know better, vetoed that, which is just appalling. Last year, I sponsored a bill to ban bump stocks. If you know what a bump stock is, it's a mechanism you attach to a semi-automatic weapon that makes it fire at the rate of a fully automatic weapon. And these were used in the Las Vegas shooting that killed 58 people. The shooter had a number of semi-automatic guns and bump stocks that he shot at a crowd from an elevated location. There's only one purpose for a bump stock. It's not hunting. It's not self-defense. It's killing people. And I introduced that bill because I thought it was the lowest of lowest hanging fruit. And I thought, let's see what we can do. And the governor refused to even put it on the agenda.
I agree with most of what Matthew said. The guns are an example of an issue that has become so partisan and polarized. It's a no-brainer. All of us care about our safety. All of us care about our children's safety. All of us care about the, we all want our public places to be safe. And the way to solve this complex problem is to have a dialogue, to let down who gets credit for doing what. There are a lot of, this has become so polarized that nobody is willing to accommodate each other, and I believe as an independent, I can bring both sides together and we can make firearm safety really happen. It won't happen right away, but we can take incremental steps. And, you know, bump stocks are a convenient buzzword, but hundreds of people are killed with firearms. Bump stocks were used in one incident. Getting rid of them isn't the panacea. It's very complex. We need to, when you say background checks, there are lots of different kinds of background checks, and we need to have a dialogue and engage the people who own guns and believe in the Second Amendment, and then we can walk towards each other and end up with something that is, instead of being gridlocked the way we are now.
Back to Jarrett for a 2-minute question. What changes would you like to see in the state's tax structure?
Let me count the ways. You know, this is one of those things that are a perennial kick the ball down the street, and we've known that we need to fix our gross receipts tax for years. There have been a lot of studies. I'm definitely in favor of creating incentives for small and entrepreneurial business to make it easier for them to live in a low tax environment. But in just one piece, in gross receipts taxes, we're one of only 2 states that tax social services. So we've kind of traded high gross receipts for low property taxes. That isn't all right. I'm in favor of allowing local jurisdictions to put a cap on the value of an owner-occupied house, but then increasing the value of property owned by speculators, owned by second home people. But we should consider an array of fixes to the gross receipts problem, to the property tax problem, and to the income tax problem. I'm not a big tax guy. I just have to tell you, I think when we take capital away from moderate people, we end up hurting them. I do also feel that the move towards an oligarchy, the distribution of wealth that's happened in the last 20 years is horrible. So I'm in favor of people having a living wage. Was it read?
Not yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in
13
favor of doing lots of economic things to help regular people out. I hope to be a voice for fiscal restraint and conservatism.
Good time.
So I think there are 2 key pieces to the tax code that we need to look at. First, actually under Governor Richardson, we passed an income tax cut, which has especially impacted high earners and corporations. And that has had a much bigger impact on our revenue than we expected. So a couple of years ago, when we were in dire financial straits because of an oil bust, and at some point hopefully we get to talk about the boom and bust of the oil cycle, but we were in an oil bust and we had passed this tax cut. That's a problem. I'm certainly willing to look at the income tax because I want to make sure that people are paying a fair share. And I absolutely believe that's important. The other piece is the gross receipts tax. We need to reform that. There was a while in the history of the legislature where if you had a good enough lobbyist, you could get your industry a carve out or an exemption. We need to eliminate those. The gross receipts tax was intended to be a low tax that was broadly applicable. And then we started carving it up. And so the tax rate went higher to compensate for that. So instead of a low tax that's broadly applicable, it got higher and less applicable. And we need to reverse that trend. And I can tell you that's on the agenda for the next session.
Next question, 2 minutes. What can our state do to reduce our carbon footprint, given that the state is so dependent on fossil fuel revenue? And that is Matthew.
You know, I'm chair of the Interim Water and Natural Resources Committee, and I put this on the agenda. We had a meeting up in Farmington where P&M is getting ready to close the San Juan Generating Station, which is a coal-fired power plant. And we had the meeting in Farmington so we could talk about what they were going to do next. And that meeting, there was a lot of heads in the sand up there. to reduce our carbon footprint as a state, the biggest thing we can do is increase the renewable portfolio standard. It's currently 20, so renewable portfolio standard is for a utility. They have to have a certain percentage of renewable energy in their overall portfolio by a set date. So it's currently 20% by 2020. I was at an event last night with Michelle Lujan Grisham. I think it needs to go to 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2040 or 2050. So I mean that's the biggest thing we can do. We can also provide incentives. You know, right now wind and solar are out competing oil and gas and certainly coal. That being said, they're more economically competitive at the utility industrial scale, so the really big locations. And then we end up building transmission lines to California and Arizona. And those have their own impacts that we have to be sensitive to. I would like to see us return to the solar tax credit, where you can get a tax credit for putting solar panels on your own home. And I've carried that legislation multiple times, and we will carry that again in the next session.
Matthew's right that the way to reduce our carbon footprint is to make more of the energy we consume come from renewable sources. Really, most of the degradation of our carbon isn't from energy producing. The resource that's harmed by a lot of our energy production is water, not air. So if we're talking about carbon and air quality, it's really ties right back to how the energy is produced, and driving around. You know, we all play a role in it. Here's the thing: the Democrats have controlled our legislature, both sides, since time immemorial. This has been a huge issue for 2 decades. We haven't made any progress. I think, like a lot of things, we need to have a different kind of dialogue, and not just keep getting hung up. Of course, everybody here wants less pollution. Most of us have children. Some of us have grandchildren. We want them to inherit a cleaner planet. And so this shouldn't be something that divides us. I think it's a high priority for Representative McQueen. It would be a high priority for me as well.
Another 2-minute question, starting with Jarrett. What is your opinion on the water consumed in the process of fracking?
Oh gosh, I tiptoed into that in the last question. You know, water is our most precious asset by a long shot. And fracking, to my understanding, contaminates water. And until it's demonstrated that fracking can be done without degrading water quality, I think it's a bad practice, particularly when you're using groundwater, when you're using fresh water, and when you're injecting dirty water back into the aquifer. I think we've got the technology. I think there are a lot of things we can do to reduce the actual impact, to restore water quality in the fracking process. But I wouldn't be surprised if Representative McQueen knows more about that than I do.
So last week, actually, I spent 2 days down in Hobbs. Or staying in Hobbs. And then we went out, and this was the House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee that I chaired, and it was part of the speaker's listening tour. We went out and toured the oil fields. I visited a drilling site, a frac site, and a water recycling site. And a lot of stuff is going on out in the Permian Basin. First of all, it's the biggest oil play in the country right now, which is amazing. That's why we have this incredible surplus coming in. And absolutely, we need to protect our water resources. The state land office has told drillers they can no longer get easements for freshwater wells to use in fracking. Now, sometimes in the drilling, they need to use fresh water as they're drilling through a freshwater aquifer to get to the oil below. So in order to avoid contaminating that aquifer, they do use fresh water for that. What's interesting is that partly because of the state land office action, and partly because they know it's coming, they're starting to look at how to recycle the produced water. So for every barrel of oil and gas that comes out, they get 3 barrels of water. We saw a site where they're recycling 50% of that water. And it's a whole process. I mean, it's a little bit like going to the sewage treatment plant. You know, it comes in with a bunch of solids and it settles out and they strain it and the whole 9 yards. And then they use it, they put it back, not re-inject it, but use it for their fracking. To me, the issue of fracking, which is very controversial, you know, the Permian Basin, there's going to be fracking. We need to look at where we won't allow fracking. And one thing that keeps coming up is around Chaco Canyon. And we absolutely need to protect cultural resources. We actually absolutely need to protect aquifers. So we need to limit where fracking can occur.
2-minute question, starting with Matthew. What is your position on? Yeah, right. What is your position on restructuring the New Mexico Game Commission and on killing and trapping on public lands?
Okay, so I swear I didn't plant this question. I swear. So I have a bill, a Game Commission reform bill. Currently, they're all political appointees. It's a commission of 7. There is, in the statute, there is language that one of the appointees has to have a natural resources background and have a job that's not inconsistent with natural resources. The governor appointed an oil and gas attorney to that position. So my proposal, it changes the way they're appointed. There would be 3 at-large members, 1 from each congressional district. Then there would be a member from the ag community. There would be a member from the environmental community. There would be a member from the hunting and fishing community. And there would be a scientist affiliated with one of our state universities. They would have overlapping terms, only removed for cause, and basically, you know, just create some continuity and some professionalism on the commission. And that's something we need to do. I tried to do it. I thought it was a really fair bill. It died in my House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee on the 6-6 party line vote. But that's absolutely something I want to revisit. Trapping is cruel. It should not happen on public lands.
To address trapping first, it is cruel and it shouldn't happen on public lands. I'd like to see it restrained on private lands. And the kind of restructure that Representative McQueen proposes for the commission itself seems good on its face. I don't have enough specific expertise. The idea of having our fishing and hunting interests represented by a broad group rather than just entrenched industry partisans is good. I particularly like the fact that he would propose to have somebody from the animal welfare community sitting in that seat. We certainly don't need more 6-6 party line votes. That's exactly why we're in so much trouble now.
Next question is 2 minutes, starting with Jarrett. District 50 spans 4 counties. How will you represent the diverse interests of such a large geographic base?
Well, you know, I have 3 different campaigns. I don't know what the 4, well, there's only 1 precinct in Bernalillo County. It has 250 voters. So in truth, most of District 50 is in Santa Fe County. Santa Fe County itself, though, isn't too, if we were drawing jurisdictions around communities of interest, southern Santa Fe County is in a different world than northern Santa Fe County. When you leave the Galisteo Basin and you enter the Estancia Basin, you're entering a different world. You're entering a different hydrology. You're entering a different landscape. So I have a campaign down there that's mostly in southern Santa Fe County and Torrance County in the Estancia Basin. I have a Valencia County campaign for the people who live outside Berlin. And then I have an El Dorado campaign, and it's crazy. It's not fair, it's not efficient, it's impractical, and frankly, the people in Berlin are the most disenfranchised. So what I'd do to fix it is The census is coming up in 2 years. In 3 years, there's going to be a redistricting process. What we need to do is, there are legislative fixes, but even without legislative fixes, we can have a lot fairer maps. And I will be a voice for returning the people in Belinda, the Rio Grande corridor. It's crazy. It's the reason that so few people run for office. It's the reason that incumbents have this protection racket.
So it's a big district. It's 4 counties, it's 100 miles long, and the people in Chilili and Bernalillo County are just as important to me as the people in this room. I work my ass off representing the entire district. And it's hard because, like, tomorrow I have meetings in Rio communities. You know, that's most of my day, driving down there for the meetings, driving back. That's hard, but that doesn't mean I don't do it. In my mind, that you know, it's a very diverse district, but it breaks down into 3 basic areas. One is sort of the El Dorado area, which is suburban. Looking around the room, I'm going to guess and say older. And people in El Dorado are interested in, you know, national issues, climate change and things like that. I have Moriarty, Edgewood, and Rio communities. And I have half of Moriarty and half of Edgewood, but that doesn't matter. Those communities are in my district. Those communities are desperately interested in economic development. Edgewood and Moriarty are along Interstate 40. Rio Communities has a railroad spur on the BNSF Railroad. They are poised for economic development. And then within the district, there are 4 traditional land grant communities: Torreon, Tehique, Manzano, and Chilili. These are governmental entities that have no income, no taxing authority, nothing. So they have their own special needs. You know, when they want a fire station like Chilili wanted, or a community center like Manzano wants, you know, they come to me, and hopefully I'm in a position to help them. And as I said, you know, open door policy, anyone in the district. I represent the entire district, and I hope to continue to do that.
So 1-minute question. Is party affiliation important in the state legislature, Matthew?
It is and it isn't. You know, who you caucus with is incredibly important, mainly in electing leadership. So if, you know, the Speaker of the House is Brian Egolf, if we don't re-elect Brian Egolf, you know, everything we've worked for could be scuttled by a Republican Speaker, because the Speaker is an incredibly powerful position. I work across the aisle whenever it's feasible and appropriate. My public corruption bill that I talked about earlier, a friend of mine, a conservative senator from Albuquerque, was interested in that bill, asked to co-sponsor it, Mark Morris. I'm working on a transparency bill with Senator Sandra Root to bring transparency to the capital outlay process. And I'm working on my financial literacy bill with Jim Dines of Albuquerque. So absolutely, you know, on some issues it matters a lot, and other issues you're just trying to do what's best for New Mexico.
Boy, party affiliation has become a pox. It's become a plague, and it didn't used to be that way. I did some growing up in Washington, D.C. at a time when all congressmen lived in D.C. and got to know each other and know each other's kids. And they had real relationships that transcended their politics. And they were routinely crossing the aisles and going back and forth. There was none of this putting party ahead of country. There was none of this hyper-partisanship. You know, back then, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill disagreed on everything and were great friends. I believe that we need to restore that. The two-party system worked well up until 20 years ago, and then it's become more hyper-partisan. It's abandoned its moderate middle, and we need to make party affiliation far less important.
Okay. 2-minute question, starting with Jarrett. What is your position on any legislation on women's reproductive health in the state?
I'm not aware of what's pending in the state. I'm not a member of the legislature, but I can tell you that I have good friends who are very strong, who believe that life begins at conception and that abortion is murder. I have close friends who believe that life begins at birth and that abortion is a right. Where I stand is that those are private family matters and they should not be dictated by governments. I think families and women should have control of their bodies and control of their reproductive decisions, and we shouldn't let governments get in the middle of those decisions.
So this is the issue that I did the most work on the first time I ran, because it was an issue I needed to learn about. And the first thing I did, being a lawyer, was I pulled up the statutes. And I read the statutes, and I said, oh my God, this can't be right. And the fact is, we have incredibly restrictive abortion statutes on the books here in New Mexico. So, if Brett Kavanaugh gets appointed to the Supreme Court, and they overturn Roe versus Wade, or they start to chip away at it, our very restrictive abortion statutes will come back into play. So a top priority for the next session is we need to change those. We need to get statutes on the books that reflect what I think is a majority position here in New Mexico, and in my position, that we're going to trust women to make their own decisions.
Starting with Matthew, a 2-minute question. What is your position on supporting Amtrak and the Southwest Chief? I guess this is a state issue, I'm not sure.
The Southwest Chief runs through Lamy. Trains are, we're in the railroad room, right? So I mean, we got our, they're not what they once were, but they're still important. And the Southwest Chief serves a bunch of communities that are important. And it's also, it's tourism, it's industry, it's a bunch of things. And I support that. It is a mix of state and federal funding, and I absolutely think we need to see that continue. I believe Martin Heinrich has been instrumental in supporting that as well.
I agree. I think that it would have a real impact on our local economy, not just in Lamy, but in Santa Fe. There are people who are visitors who get off the train. There are people who live here to use the train to go other places. And we should try to keep local train service. And I certainly would be an advocate, both from a local community standpoint, but from a broader economic development standpoint.
2 minutes, starting with Jarrett. What is your position on legalizing marijuana?
Oh gosh, unless I'm confronted with public safety data from states that have already legalized it that say it has an adverse public safety, I'm fine with legalization for recreational use. I'm also in favor of developing an industrial hemp production in industry in this state.
I'm absolutely in favor of medical marijuana, and we passed a bill that the governor vetoed to expand medical marijuana to include the treatment of opioid addiction. Why that got vetoed, I have no idea. I'm certainly open to legalizing recreational marijuana, but I have two key concerns. And part of the process of hearing this bill is you have the presentation, debate, and hopefully these will get fleshed out. My two concerns, one is impaired driving. We already have a huge impaired driving problem in New Mexico, mostly based on alcohol. Marijuana does impair you. There's no, blood alcohol, breathalyzer kind of test for marijuana. Marijuana affects different people in different ways, and it stays in your system longer than alcohol. So how do we address that? The second issue is, what is our message to our youth, and how do we make sure that we keep marijuana out of the hands of our youth? And that's something that's important. My understanding is the studies show that heavy use at a young age can still affect brain development, and so I'm concerned about that. In the meantime, however, we should absolutely decriminalize it. We shouldn't be putting people in jail for marijuana possession.
2-minute question. This might only need one, but starting with Matthew. Do you support term limits for the state legislature?
You know, term limits are interesting. I used to always support term limits, and now being there and seeing, believe me, my wife's not going to let me stay there forever. Seeing how people develop expertise is really remarkable. And I'll tell you about Lucky Varela. Lucky Varela had been in the legislature a long time. In my first year, he was gone. He had some surgery, some foot issues, and for health reasons, he missed most of that session. And I didn't know Lucky, and I was like, who is this guy? And, the next year he came back, and his knowledge about the way that place works and the way we've done things before, and the contents of every appropriations bill going back 40 years, that is irreplaceable. So term limits, I think term limits are important at the governor's level. I think they're working fine at the county commission level. Term limits in the legislature empower two groups, staff people and lobbyists, because you would lose all of your institutional expertise if you lost some of your more senior members.
It's a complex issue. I'm in favor of term limits as a last resort. I think we need new blood in our legislature all the time. And I think the right way to get it is by opening primaries, by making it the same process for people to run who don't belong to a party as people who do belong to a party. I think that if we get enough candidates and enough competition, we will be throwing out the people who aren't representing us well and bringing in new blood. But if we can't do that, we may need term limits. There are lots of legislative leaders like Lucky, like Aubrey Dunn, like John Arthur Smith, who just, they acquire, like, who's this highway, Mills? Ernie, who am I thinking of?
In the Congress?
No, our state rep right here, Max Cole. Max Cole is an example of somebody who just grew in his office, and he wasn't a partisan guy, and so I would hate to say we have to lose all the expertise of people like Max and Lucky, but if the alternative is having what we have now, which is half the people don't even have an opponent. That's an indictment of the system. We have no young people running for the legislature, and if we have to do something else in order to get more competition, then we'll open up primaries. We'll get rid of just little things. He's first on the ballot. You know why? Because he belongs to a party. I don't. There's a drawing that determines whether the R's are first or the D's are first, but I'm second because I'm independent. There's lots of little things like that that are unfair, and we need to change those.
2 minutes, starting with Jarrett. What is your idea for tax reform? Any specifics?
Oh yeah, I think we touched on this a little earlier. Instead of kicking the ball down the road on gross receipts tax reforms, we should impanel a broad group of experts and charge them with making recommendations. We should lay out the ground rules about the outcomes we want, but certainly our whole kind of economy has changed since our gross receipts framework was put into place, and there are probably reforms to it to modernize it that I haven't heard of, but we should definitely do that. The particular thing about our gross receipts tax rate that bothers me is, unlike Washington, unlike Oregon, we don't have an exemption. We don't help entrepreneurs who are starting out, and people, the artisans in El Dorado are very much like the ranchers in the Estancia Valley. They're small-scale businesses, and anything we can do to help them prosper means they'll hire more people, they'll generate more prosperity overall. So I want to make it easier for them by lowering taxes. I've talked about property taxes. I think more property taxes should devolve to local jurisdictions where people, we live in such an incredibly diverse state, and what works in Rama isn't going to work in Albuquerque, and it isn't going, that's why having the state say the minimum wage should be this or that is wrong, because a dollar goes a lot further in some places than others, and local governments know best what a living wage is, and they have the authority. They should use it. We should encourage them to create living wages based on their own cost of living.
So 2 years ago, it was 2 years ago, might have been last year, the House actually passed a tax reform package, and it passed unanimously. And it was to simplify the GRT and lower the rate. And it was sponsored by Jason Harper out of Albuquerque, Republican. Passed unanimously. The Senate put the brakes on that, and rightfully so. Because the Senate said, oh, okay, what's going to be the fiscal impact of this? So the Senate put the brakes on it. I think that was the right move. We commissioned a study, and the Republicans are very upset that we were spending taxpayer money to study the tax code. But we commissioned this study to see what our options were and what the fiscal impact would be. That's absolutely on the agenda for the next session. Just so you get a flavor of it, one of the exemptions is for cage fighting. Okay? So, I mean, we have all these weird special interest exemptions. Hopefully we can simplify that.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have. We'll now go to 2-minute closing statements, going in reverse order to where we started. So I'll start with Jarrett for 2-minute closing.
Well, I didn't want to step on my 3-minute opening statement by saying how grateful I am to the League for moderating that, and really to all of you for coming. I mean, we would have a much better democracy if most people took their civic responsibilities as seriously as you do. So I'm grateful. I think Representative McQueen and I face low crowds sometimes, and it's discouraging to get people off the couch. And so I want to thank everybody who's here. I also have a number of supporters in this room. I didn't know any of them 9 months ago. And so, to have a whole bunch of new friends is exciting. I mean, someone like Lacey, who's manning the camera back there, drove up here. She had to get a babysitter, right? She lives in McIntosh. She's a homegrown product, and she came up here because she's really interested in what's going on. I love Tim McQueen is sitting next to her. He drove up here from Albuquerque. He wants to smash the duopoly. But most of all, I want to, tomorrow is my 37th wedding anniversary. And when I told my wife Dinah, when I asked her if I could have permission to run, she said, well, what do I have to do? And I said, oh, nothing. Maybe just kiss a few babies. You don't have to do anything. Boy, did I misrepresent the situation. She hasn't missed a meet and greet. She hasn't been to this facility for 2 days. She was here on Sunday for the barbecue with the fire department. She's written 2 checks to my campaign, as have my kids, one of whom, a paramedic and firefighter, is right there, and her siblings have also contributed. So I just want to thank you for being there, for caring, and I particularly want to thank the people who are helping me create a more fair and more open kind of democracy in our state.
So a couple things I want to touch on quickly. I will admit I was sort of dreading coming to this because so far the campaign's been what I consider nasty. Jarrett has repeatedly accused me privately, or pretty much anyone who'll listen, of violating the campaign finance laws with no basis. When I sat down with him to try to set him straight on that, he went on social media and basically called me a liar. And I really don't appreciate that. I mean, if this campaign is going to be about issues, let's make it about issues. He's decried the lack of competition in New Mexico. It's not about gerrymandering or anything like that. If you want competition for these races, you've got to pay the legislators. So in House District 49, south of me, there's an open seat. I talked to 3 different people, 3 different Democrats that ran for that seat. A retired Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who would have excellent expertise, an organic farmer that runs a nonprofit, and a young Hispanic guy who's still in school but active in politics. Any one of them would have been a fantastic candidate. And they all said they couldn't afford to do it. So if there is a constituency that's well represented in the legislature, it's the I'm a rich guy and I don't have to work constituency. We don't need more of that. We also in the legislature have a golden opportunity. We can really make change in New Mexico. We can turn around our education system. We can open up our economic development to local business, to service business, to homegrown New Mexico businesses, rather than the Hail Marys to Tesla and Google. We can do a lot in New Mexico. There's a lot of work to be done. I ask you to send me back and let me do that work.
And that, I assume, is the applause I was going to ask for both candidates. And that concludes tonight's forum. Thank you.
Thank you.